For most people, identity isn't something they built. It's something that got installed by a job loss, a relationship, a failure, and they've been living it ever since without questioning it. You didn't sit down one day and decide who you're going to be. Something happened, and in that moment, without you realizing it, a belief got installed, and that belief became your identity, and you've been running on it ever since. A guy commented on one of my videos today, said that after he lost his job, his identity became, I am not in control. Now, he didn't choose that. He didn't build that. It just moved in, and he's been a mess ever since. That's not an unusual story. That is most people. The problem isn't that life happened to you. The problem is that you never went back and decided who you actually are on purpose. So you're still running on whatever got installed by the hardest thing that happened to you, by the loudest voice around you, by the moment that hit you before you were ready for it. Today, we're going to change that because you were never supposed to be whoever the hardest moment made you. First, we have a label problem. Most people think they already know who they are. Ask them and they'll tell you without hesitating, I'm a good person. I'm a Christian. I'm a hard worker. I'm a loyal friend. Now, I'm not saying those things aren't true. Maybe every one of them is true. But what I am saying is that's a label, not a definition. And there's a massive difference between the two. A label is just a name. It's what you call yourself when things are easy and nothing's on the line. A definition is what actually holds up when life puts pressure on it. Here's the most important sentence in this entire video, so write it down. You don't rise to what you say you are. You fall to what you've actually defined. That's good. Write that down. Because most people have been operating on the assumption that saying it is enough. That calling yourself a hard worker or an honest person or a good parent means you are one. But the label and the reality are two completely different things. And the gap between them only shows up under pressure. The person who says, I'm a hard worker, but can't push through when they're tired and no one's watching, that's a label without a definition. The person who says, I'm honest, but goes quiet when the truth is going to cost them something, that's the same thing. Label without definition. Pressure doesn't lie. It shows you the difference between what you said and what you actually built. Which begs the question, what is identity really? Every identity you've ever had started with something that happened to you. When something hard happens, a job loss, a failed marriage, an accident, a betrayal, the event itself isn't the problem. Events are neutral. They're just things that occurred. The problem is what you do next. Your brain doesn't let events just sit there. It immediately asks a question. What does this mean? And whatever answer you give, that becomes a belief, which is a statement you now hold as true about how the world works. Like, control is out of my hands. People can't be trusted. I'm not good enough. I don't belong here. That's a belief. Third person. A description of reality as you now see it. But here's where it gets dangerous. The moment that belief gets personal, the moment it stops being about the world and starts being about you, it becomes an identity statement. And identity statements always start the same way. With I am. I am not in control. I am someone people easy to leave. I am not the kind of person who succeeds at things. And the second those two words attach to the belief, something happens that most people never see coming. You inherit a whole life because every identity comes fully loaded. It already has characteristics. The way a person who believes that about themselves acts, speaks, carries himself. It already has values, what they prioritize, what they avoid, what they tolerate. It already has rules, the invisible standards that govern what someone like that does or doesn't do. And you didn't write any of it. You didn't choose any of it. But the moment you said, I am, you signed up for all of it. And then you started practicing it every single day without realizing that's what you're doing. The repetition of living inside that identity produces behavior. And that behavior, compounded over months and years, becomes your life. Your whole life downstream of a generalization you made about one event. That's how it works when it goes wrong. And here's the thing. It works exactly the same way when it goes right. The chain doesn't care which direction you run it, it just runs. Which means if you go upstream, if you choose the belief deliberately, build the identity on purpose and define what that actually looks like, everything downstream follows just the same. Same chain, different starting point, completely different life. That's what this is about. Now I'm going to give you my identity stack. To give you an example, I don't have one identity, I have three. I'm a Christian, I'm a Wilkinson, and I'm a fighter. Now those might sound like three different things pulling in three different directions, but they don't compete. They stack. They reinforce each other. And the reason they work together is because they all sit under the same belief. One foundation, multiple expressions of the same person. Let me define each one, because this is the part that actually matters. What does a Christian look like? A Christian is supposed to be Christ-like. That's not a metaphor, that's the actual job description. So if you want to know what a Christian looks like, you don't guess. You go to the source, you read the Bible, and you study about Jesus. And when you do that, here's what you'll find. Jesus told the truth when it was uncomfortable and costly. He didn't chase approval. He lost followers over it. He didn't bend under pressure, not social pressure, not political pressure, not threat of death. He moved toward hard things instead of away from them. He served people nobody else wanted to deal with, and he stood on something higher than his own feelings and other people's opinions. That's not a feeling, that's a description. That's what it looks like in practice, because that's what it looked like in his. Now, what does a Wilkinson look like? Now, I watched this growing up. My family name meant something to every Wilkinson I ever met, and I paid attention to why. Wilkinsons, they help people, they work hard, they take responsibility, they build things, they stand up for themselves and for others. They don't quit. That's not aspirational, that's what I watched. My dad was a teacher, a coach, and an athletic director. He came home from that job and we did farm work, cutting wood, mending fences, taking care of animals, maintaining the land. In the summer, he worked an overnight shift at a manufacturing plant. My sister was always in a wheelchair and required constant care. My mom made breakfast and dinner every single day, and we ate together as a family. Everyone contributed. Everything mattered. When I cut the grass for the first time, my mom inspected it and told me I did a horrible job. So I had to do it again. Excellence wasn't optional. And for some things on that farm, the life of an animal depended on how well you did your work. So everything felt important and the stakes were always real. I still work like that. And when I don't, it nags me. So what does a fighter look like? I wanted to be a badass when I got into martial arts. So I did what made sense to me. I studied the people I thought were badasses. When I eventually became friends with some of them, I asked them about their training. Turns out we were all trained similarly and had similar stories. And when I started paying attention to what made them that way, I noticed specific things. They were fearless in word and deed. They worked incredibly hard. They weren't afraid to tell the truth. They were strong emotionally, physically, and mentally. A fighter gets knocked down and gets back up, moves toward pressure instead of away from it, acts without needing any guarantees, keeps going even when it costs something. Now watch what happens when those three identities stack. Truth from the Christian, responsibility from the Wilkinson, and pressure tolerance from the fighter. But what I want to tell you, what that actually feels like on the inside, because it's nothing like what you would expect. I don't feel empowered. I don't feel a surge of confidence. I don't have a moment where I stand tall and everything feels clear and cinematic. What I have is simpler than that and more useful. The decision is already made. Not in the moment, not when the pressure shows up, before any of it. The belief was chosen, the identity built, the characteristics were defined. So when something hard arrives, and something hard always arrives, there's no meeting or no negotiation, no what do I do here? The answer was upstream. The pressure just activates it. Now here's the part that surprised me about myself. Light pressure is actually harder for me than heavy pressure. Light pressure means the outcome is still negotiable. It still might work out in my favor. I might still get what I want. So the tension is real between what I want and what's right. That fight is genuine, and I don't always enjoy it. But heavy pressure removes the negotiation entirely. What I want stops mattering because there's no room for it anymore. The only thing left is the correct thing, and I already know what that is. Most people fall apart when the pressure gets heavy, but for me, that's when everything gets simple. That's what a built identity actually does. It doesn't make life easier. It makes the hardest moments the clearest ones. And the people who can't move you, the culture, the opinions, the noise, they lose their leverage completely because the decision they're trying to influence was never theirs to make. It was made a long time ago, upstream, before they ever showed up. Now, sometimes identity breaks. Here's what happened when your beliefs are unclear or you're pulling from systems that don't agree with each other. Your identities don't stack. They compete. Now you're hesitating, you're second guessing, overthinking, shrinking, because you don't actually know which version of you is in charge. So you stall, you wait, you look for signals, you read the room, you adjust, not because you're weak, because your system is. And when pressure shows up, it exposes it immediately. That's most people. They don't have one identity. They have fragments. They don't have a complete identity. They just have fragments. Pieces pulled from different places, culture, emotion, experience, other people, all trying to run at the same time. And whichever one feels strongest in the moment wins. That's why people feel inconsistent. That's why they don't trust themselves. That's why their behavior keeps changing, because nothing is actually in charge. And if your identity doesn't hold up under pressure, it's not your identity yet. It's just a label you haven't proven. Now, the next part is there is a fight for your identity. Here's something I want you to understand before we go any further. There are two systems actively competing for the right to define who you are. I call them God culture and human culture. Now, I work with children. I start kids at 3 years old, and I've watched many of them train for 8, 10, 12 years. So I've had a front row seat to something most people never get to observe. When kids are young, like 3, 4, 5, they are pure. They are full of wonder. They get excited over a bug on the floor or a new smell in the room. They notice everything. They notice my shoes, a different pen I'm using for the day, a new haircut. They are completely present and completely themselves. There's no mask, no performance, no filter. They are just who they are. Then something happens. They enter the socialization phase where they go to school and they get in groups, and slowly over time, the adults around them call it maturity. But what I actually watched was something else. I watched kids learn to put on a mask, to not get noticed, to blend in, to manage how other people see them. The wonder starts to shrink. The questions come less often. The openness closes down. That pure thing gets traded for something safer. That's human culture doing its work. Human culture builds identity on feelings, on comfort, on the approval of other people. It tells you the truth is flexible, that you get to define your own. It says there's no real design to life, no real purpose. Just figure out what makes you happy and chase it. It puts your feelings and your preferences at the center of everything. And when something challenges that, when someone tells you the truth you didn't want to hear, or asks you to stand for something that will cost you, human culture has no answer for that, because it was never built to hold up under pressure. Now, God culture works completely differently. God culture says truth is fixed. It's not flexible, not something that you define for yourself. It says you were created, not by accident, not from an explosion, but on purpose, with a design for a specific reason. It says your identity isn't something you invent. It's something you discover and then build toward. It says there is a standard for how life works when it's working right, and that standard doesn't move based on how you feel about it. Now, here's what I notice about my students. Kids, before human culture gets its hooks all the way in, that they love the truth. I could tell a 6-year-old your technique is terrible. and here's how you fix it. And they would smile. As long as I offered them a fix, they were happy to hear it. They improved and felt good about it. No drama, no defense. But adults, that same honesty would send them sideways. They got their feelings hurt. They got defensive. Some of them would quit. Not because the truth was cruel, but because human culture had spent 20 or 30 years teaching them that comfort is the priority and truth is negotiable. That's what's at stake when you don't define your identity deliberately. If you don't build it intentionally from something real, something fixed, something that holds, human culture will build it for you. And it will build it on approval, comfort, and feelings. And that identity will look fine on a good day, but the first time real pressure shows up, it's going to fall apart. So, you've named your identity. You've said, I'm a Christian, or I'm a good father, or I'm a person of integrity. Now what? Because here's where most people stop. They claim the identity and think the work is done, but it's not, because the name is still just a label. Identity doesn't have depth until you define its characteristics. And characteristics answer one simple question. What does that person actually look like? Not in theory, in real life, day to day, under pressure. What would I actually observe if I followed this person around for a week? The way I developed mine wasn't from a book or seminar. I watched people. I'll give you an example. My grandmother, a Wilkinson, walked out of a church service one Sunday, and the preacher asked her what she thought about the sermon. And she looked at him and said, I didn't too much care for it. And he smiled and said that he would do better. I was a kid and I couldn't stop thinking about it. This woman just told a preacher the sermon wasn't good and she didn't enjoy it. With no apology, no softening, just the truth, plain, and then it was done. That moment stayed with me for decades. That was a characteristic that I wanted. Now, my martial arts instructor was a complicated man. He wasn't someone you'd hold up as a role model in every area of his life, but he worked relentlessly and he took the training with absolute seriousness. He pushed us harder than we thought we could go, and ironically, that's exactly how you train someone to be a badass. I didn't like everything about him, but I didn't have to. This is where I developed something I think of as a personality store. I don't have to take the whole person. I can walk into the personality store, look around, and take the quality I want to incorporate while leaving the rest on the shelf. My instructor's work ethic and intensity, I'll take those. Some of the other things, I will leave those. This changed everything for me because it meant I wasn't limited to imitating one person perfectly. I could build deliberately. I could study anyone, someone I admire, historical figure, Christ himself, and identify specific characteristics that belong to the identity I was trying to become. And then I could practice those until they were mine. Here's what I want you to understand about this. Life skills, things like honesty, courage, self-control, discipline, leadership, those aren't random virtues floating around. They are characteristics of a well-defined identity. They're descriptions of what that person looks like in real life. And when you connect them to a specific identity, instead of just adding them to a general be better list, they'll stick because now they have a home. A Christian doesn't practice honesty because honesty is on a list somewhere. A Christian practices honesty because it's a characteristic of who Christ was and therefore of who a Christian is trying to be. The identity drives the characteristic, not the other way around. Now there's another part to all this, which is values. Now here's where it gets practical in a way that will change how you operate under pressure. I opened my school when I was 19, got married 19, had a kid at 19. And around that time, the martial arts industry was trying to position itself as a life skills profession. We were selling lessons built around things like courtesy, honesty, self-control, integrity, and I was right there in the middle of it doing it. Until the day a parent walked in and said, I hear martial arts is great for discipline. I told her it was the best thing she could do for her kid. And she looked at me and asked, really? How does it do that? I had no answer. I was selling something I hadn't actually studied. So I went and got a dictionary. I went through every life skill connected to martial arts and started figuring out the actual mechanics. How do these things work? How do you actually install discipline in a child? I tested the ideas on students before my own son could even walk. I figured it was if I was going to be a good father, I needed to understand how all this works deeply, not just repeat what I'd been told. And here's what I found out. The life skills, the characteristics, they're all good, but some of them conflict with each other. So I started asking parents a question. What's more important to you, telling the truth or being nice? I thought the answer was going to be obvious. I thought everyone was going to say telling the truth, but it was about 50-50. And that freaked me out a little bit because those parents weren't wrong exactly. Being nice is good, but is it the most good? And when those two things collide, when you have to choose between them in a real moment, which one wins? And here's what I believe. Truth is designed to hurt a little. Not to be cruel, but to convict, to create just enough discomfort that a person considers changing course. If it doesn't land with some weight, there's no reason for them to change anything. So when I tell someone the truth that stings, in my mind, I am being nice. I am doing the most loving thing available to me in that moment. But from their perspective, I'm not being nice at all. That conclusion, that gap between how I see it and how they experience it, that's a values question, not a feelings question, not a mood. A question about what I actually prioritize when two good things come into conflict. That's what values are. Values are the ranking system inside your identity. They don't replace your characteristics, they prioritize them. They answer one question. When two things I believe collide, which one am I going to choose? And here's the part that matters most practically. That decision should not be made in the moment. In fighting, for instance, I learned early that your first instinct under attack is your most real response. Everything else has to be trained in advance, rehearsed, and decided before the moment ever arises. Because if you have to invent what to do when someone attacks you, the hesitation, it can get you killed. The gap between I don't know and I know is exactly where bad things happen. Identity works the same way. If you haven't decided in advance which characteristics win when two of them collide, fear is going to decide. Comfort will decide. Social pressure will decide. And none of those are you. Here's how I worked mine out. I value honesty above courtesy, not because I don't care about people's feelings. I do. But because the identity I claimed and characteristics I studied point clearly in that direction. Christ told the rich young ruler exactly what following him would cost, even though the man walked away sad. He didn't soften it to protect the relationship. He told the truth and let the man make his choice. So I tell the truth, even when it costs me. I've had friends get angry, students who quit, parents who left. Some of them came back years later and said, thank you. And also, you're an asshole. Both things were true. They knew I cared, though. Their other friends just let them keep on going the direction they were going. But I didn't. And here's the part I want you to really hear. I was at peace with all of it. Not because I don't value relationships, but because the decision was already made upstream. I knew who I worked for. I don't work for the approval of other people. I work for God. That's not arrogance, that is clarity. When you know who you work for, you know what to do when the choices get hard. I hate hesitation. In a fight, hesitation is dangerous. In life, hesitation is expensive. When your values are decided in advance, rooted in your identity, which is rooted in your belief, you don't hesitate. You already know what to do. That's the whole point of choosing an identity. Now, I want to say something that most people won't tell you. If you live a clearly defined identity, a real one built on something solid, some people are not going to like it. Good. A real identity doesn't bend to keep people comfortable. It can't. The moment it starts bending, it stops being an identity and goes back to being a reaction or a label. But I know what some of you are thinking, because I've had this conversation hundreds of times. You're thinking about a specific person, a family member, a friend, a coworker, someone whose opinion has more weight than it probably should. And the idea of living so clearly defined that it makes them uncomfortable, that feels like too high a price. I want to talk directly to you, that person right now. You've been making yourself smaller for a long time. not all at once. It happened gradually, a little here, a little there. You softened your opinion. You stayed quiet when you should have spoken. You went along with something you didn't agree with because the friction wasn't worth it. And you've been doing that so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to just be who you actually are without managing everyone else's reaction to it. That is not peace. That's a prison with comfortable walls. Now, here's the reality. There are 330 million people in this country, 8 billion on this planet. You do not need all of them to approve of you. You do not need all of them to be comfortable around you. You need to actually be who you say you are. And the people who align with you, they'll find you. There are plenty of them. The people who get uncomfortable when you stop shrinking, some of them will adjust, some of them won't. And the ones who won't were never actually for you. They were for the version of you that made their life easier. A clearly defined identity will cost you some relationships that were never really relationships to begin with. That's not a loss. That's a filter. Now, the cost of being clearly defined is that some people will be uncomfortable around you. That's not a problem. That's confirmation that something is real in there. So here's the whole thing laid out simply. You start with belief. Belief is the foundation. It's what you actually accept as true about life at the deepest level. Belief produces identity. When your belief is clear, it tells you who you are. I believe in Christ is a belief. I am a Christian is the identity that grows out of it. Identity has characteristics. What does a Christian actually look like? What would you observe if you followed them around? Those characteristics are real, studyable, practicable. They are the working definition of the identity. Characteristics have a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is your values. When two characteristics collide in a moment, your values decide which one wins. And that decision should be made in advance, not under pressure. When your values are clear, your standards almost write themselves, because standards are just the practical rules of everything you've already decided. The hard thinking happen at the level of belief and identity. Standards are where that thinking shows up in your daily life. And after standards comes discipline, and that's its own conversation for another video. But discipline is where you practice living inside your standards, where you find out what works and what needs adjusting. It's not punishment, it's practice. The chain is belief, identity, and characteristics and values are the depth of identity. Then standards, discipline, behavior, and outcomes. Get the belief right and everything downstream follows. But it starts with the decision most people have never made, to stop reacting, to stop drifting, to define yourself deliberately so that when pressure shows up, you already know who's going to show up with it. A feather in the wind goes wherever the wind decides. You don't have to live like that. This video is part of a series where I walk you through each link of the chain. It's a system that I call the framework. Subscribe so you don't miss them.